David had lived in the same quiet suburban neighborhood for years, a place where the trees lined the streets like soldiers standing guard. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least, they liked to think they did. I was no different. I had been there long enough to see the same faces at the corner store, hear the same gossip at the annual block party, and get to know my neighbors in ways that made me feel like a part of the community. But it wasn't until I met Karen that I began to understand how even the most pleasant of facades could hide the deepest grudges. Karen was a woman in her late 40s, a fixture in the neighborhood who could be found in her meticulously tended garden every morning, chatting with anyone who passed by. On the surface, she appeared to be the epitome of kindness, someone you'd think would greet you with a warm hug and a freshly baked pie if you ever needed it. But there was something about her, something I couldn't quite place, that made me uneasy from the start. It wasn't until I started to notice her comments that I realized the true nature of our relationship. At first, they were subtle, seemingly harmless remarks. "David, you really should mow the lawn more often," she'd say with a smile, though she made sure I knew she was referring to the overgrown grass in front of my house. Or, "Are you sure you're okay with how much time your kids spend on video games? I mean, they really should be outside more, don't you think?" At first, I brushed them off. After all, people are entitled to their opinions, right? But then, the comments began to feel more pointed, more personal. She started making comments about the way I managed my life, my family, even my work. At every chance, she tried to plant a seed of doubt in my mind. Her criticisms weren't just about how I lived, they were about who I was as a person, as a father, as a neighbor. And with each remark, it started to gnaw at me. I tried to ignore her. I really did. But the problem with passive-aggressive people like Karen is that they thrive on control. And when they sense weakness, they press harder. It became evident to me that she didn't want to simply criticize. She wanted to make me feel small, to make me question myself and my choices. Every time I walked past her house, I could feel her gaze on me, and every word she spoke felt like an underhanded jab. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just targeting me. She had a way of subtly undermining everyone around her. From the way she'd whisper to the neighbor across the street about another couple's marriage to the way she'd casually mention how someone's child was struggling in school, it became clear that Karen was an expert in the art of sowing discord. But the worst part was how everyone seemed to buy into it, how her carefully curated image of being the concerned, well-meaning neighbor shielded her from the truth. But I wasn't like everyone else. I wasn't going to be swayed by her twisted games. I decided it was time to take action, but not in the way she expected. I wasn't going to confront her head-on. No, my approach would be far more subtle, far more strategic. The kind of revenge that took time to unfold, that would make her realize, too late, the consequences of her behavior. I started by getting involved in the community, something I had never really done before. I volunteered for neighborhood events, helped organize charity drives, and made a point to befriend people that Karen never took the time to connect with. It was slow at first, but as the months passed, my reputation began to grow, and I noticed something significant. People started to see me as a man of value, someone worth listening to. Karen, on the other hand, remained in the background, offering her opinions but rarely being asked for advice. As I built these new connections, I kept my eyes and ears open. I learned more about the people in the neighborhood, their personal lives, their secrets, their struggles. Some of it was trivial, like who had the best barbecue recipes or which house had the most elaborate holiday decorations. But others were far more interesting. People were willing to confide in me, and I realized that Karen had been spreading lies, painting people in a light that was far darker than they deserved. It wasn't just me. She was tearing apart the social fabric of our neighborhood with her whispered insinuations. Now, I had a choice. I could keep playing the long game, staying quiet, letting her continue with her subtle manipulations. Or, I could wait for the perfect moment to let her own lies implode. I chose the latter. It was time to pull the strings and let the truth unravel. Karen thought she could destroy others with her words, but little did she know, I was about to turn the tables. This was just the beginning. The community I had worked so hard to build would soon witness the beginning of her downfall. But I wasn't going to make it obvious. No, this was going to be as subtle as the whispers she'd planted for so many years. It was time to let the cracks in her perfect life show. And once they did, she would realize that I wasn't just the neighbor she could pick on anymore. I was the man who would take her down, piece by piece, with the same precision and care she had once used to try and break me. The first step was simple: make connections. When I started volunteering, it wasn't for the sake of getting revenge. No, I did it because I knew it would help me blend into the fabric of the neighborhood, to understand who the key players were, and most importantly, to find allies. What I quickly discovered was that people were more eager to share their lives with me than I could have imagined. As I made small talk at neighborhood events and helped out at the local food bank, I became a familiar face. People warmed to me, not because I was particularly charming or impressive, but because I listened. And listening, as I'd soon find out, was one of the most powerful tools I could wield. It didn't take long before I learned more about Karen's interactions with the others around her. Every single person I spoke with had a story, a little snippet of how Karen had interfered with their lives. From the neighbor's recent divorce, which Karen had casually blamed on a lack of communication, to the ongoing tension between two of the local families that Karen had hinted was rooted in financial mismanagement, I began to piece together a disturbing picture. Karen wasn't just a gossip, she was a manipulator. She planted ideas, made people question their relationships, and subtly steered conflicts toward the direction that suited her. And everyone was too polite to see it, or perhaps they were too embarrassed to admit it. But one thing I noticed was crucial: none of them could prove what Karen was doing. It was all whispers, offhand comments, insinuations. And that was exactly the power she wielded. People weren't willing to risk their relationships or reputations to call her out directly. They didn't have the courage to confront her. That's when I realized that, while I had my personal reasons for wanting to take her down, there was something even bigger at play here. I wasn't just taking revenge for myself, I was exposing the poison she had been spreading in this community for years. One evening, while working at a local charity event, I overheard a conversation between two of the longtime residents. They were chatting about a recent fallout between two other neighbors, and as the conversation turned toward Karen, I couldn't help but listen in. I didn't need to eavesdrop, what they were saying was loud enough to hear over the music. One of them, a woman named Linda, was talking about how Karen had manipulated her into believing that another neighbor was being unfaithful to her husband. Linda didn't seem to realize that the whole story was based on half-truths, carefully crafted to sow doubt. I don't know, Karen said she overheard something at the supermarket, and I just don't think it's right that she didn't tell me sooner, Linda said. She even said that I should be careful around her, that it's not good for me to get involved with someone who doesn't have their life in order. It was the perfect example of what Karen had been doing, using her position of trust to manipulate others and isolate them. She wasn't just spreading lies, she was destroying friendships, creating paranoia, and leaving people feeling like they couldn't trust anyone around them. As Linda spoke, I realized how Karen had used her influence to control the narrative in our neighborhood. She wasn't just playing the role of the concerned neighbor. She was orchestrating an intricate web of lies, pulling strings from the shadows. At that moment, I knew my plan needed to evolve. It wasn't just about cutting Karen down to size, it was about taking her power away, exposing her lies in a way that no one could ignore. And I had the perfect idea. I began subtly sharing bits of information with the neighbors, nothing overt, nothing that would seem out of place, but just enough to plant the seed of doubt. I'd bring up how Karen had mentioned someone, in a way that wasn't entirely clear, but with enough detail to make people curious. I'd mention how she had overheard something, but never said who the source was. By the time the next few weeks passed, I had become a trusted confidant, someone whose words carried weight. And by then, I had gathered enough of Karen's stories to start connecting the dots in a way that would make it impossible for her to deny. And all the while, Karen had no idea what I was doing. She continued to spout her gossip, dropping little bombs on the unsuspecting residents. But what she didn't know was that those bombs were slowly turning back on her. One by one, the people she had manipulated were beginning to see the cracks. And I was just getting started. The first real break came during one of our neighborhood get-togethers, a casual dinner at the local community center. It was meant to be a simple affair, good food, some wine, and friendly conversation. But it was also the perfect setting for me to start turning the tables. Karen, as always, was the center of attention, regaling everyone with some new tidbit of gossip. She was smooth, effortlessly weaving her narrative into every conversation, but I knew that the time had come. I had to make my move. I casually dropped a comment to Linda, who was sitting nearby, about how Karen had mentioned something about another neighbor's personal life. At first, it seemed harmless enough, just a bit of idle chatter. But the moment I saw Linda's expression shift from polite interest to confusion, I knew I had her hooked. "Wait, Karen told you that?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah, didn't you hear?" I replied, as if it were no big deal. "She said she'd heard about a pretty serious argument between them last week, and she thought it was something worth warning people about." Linda's eyebrows shot up. "Karen said that? I didn't know anything about it. That's odd." And just like that, I had introduced doubt. As the evening progressed, I made sure to drop a few more seeds here and there, nothing too obvious, just enough to keep the wheels turning. I could see the shift in the room. People were beginning to question Karen's narrative. Slowly, but surely, her grip on the social circle was loosening. It was only a matter of time before they all began to realize the truth. And when that moment came, when the community realized the extent of Karen's manipulations, it would be too late for her to recover. The social fabric she had so carefully crafted would unravel, and she would be left standing there, exposed for the manipulative woman she truly was. The power I had been biding my time to seize was now within my grasp, and soon, would deliver the final blow. But not yet. The story was just beginning. And I was going to enjoy every second of it. As the weeks passed, the subtle game I had started to play with Karen's reputation began to take on a life of its own. My interactions with the neighbors were now more strategic. Every conversation felt like a small piece of a much larger puzzle, one where Karen's carefully crafted image was slowly beginning to crack. It wasn't something that would happen overnight. The beauty of the plan was that it wasn't just about revealing her lies, it was about making her doubt herself. If I could get the people around her to question her credibility, to see the patterns in her behavior, Karen would do the rest. She'd unravel herself. One evening, I met with another neighbor, Mark, who had always been a little too quiet for my liking. He kept to himself, didn't interact much with the others, but I knew that was because he had been a victim of Karen's whispers. I'd overheard him mention to someone that he was considering moving out of the neighborhood. He had been living here for years, but now, for some reason, he felt like he no longer belonged. I knew why. Karen had gotten to him, and I needed to figure out how to turn that around. We sat on the front porch of my house, the warm evening air wrapping around us as we drank beer and talked about the usual: sports, work, the state of the local economy. But as the conversation shifted, I knew it was time to plant the seed. I had no idea what Mark had been told about me, but I was sure Karen had given him some version of the story where I wasn't the best neighbor. I needed to counteract whatever she had said. "I've been thinking a lot about the neighborhood recently," I began, watching Mark closely. "I guess you could say I've been a little more involved in community stuff. Volunteering, helping out, just trying to be a part of things. It's funny how many people don't realize how much good we've got going on here. You ever noticed how there are always little things being said behind closed doors?" Mark turned to me with a curious expression. "What do you mean?" I took a slow sip from my beer, letting the tension build. Oh, Karen, she's always got something to say about everyone, right? It's like she's always trying to find ways to separate people, to get them all wound up over things that don't even matter. Mark's eyebrows furrowed, and I could see the skepticism forming in his eyes. But I wasn't done. I've heard her talk about you, She's always got something about how you've been, distant from everyone, like you're shutting people out. But I know that's not true. You're just not the kind of guy to get wrapped up in that drama, right? Mark looked uncomfortable, but I could see the wheels turning. I wasn't accusing Karen outright, no, I was letting him make the connections himself. I was giving him the room to start questioning her, just as I had done with others. Yeah, well, I don't know, man, Mark said, his voice quieter now. Karen's always been a bit much, She can say some things that just don't sit right with me. I smiled inwardly. It was working. Mark was starting to realize that Karen's version of events wasn't the truth. It wasn't about winning him over in one conversation. It was about allowing him to see the cracks in her facade. You're not the only one, I said, leaning back in my chair, and you're definitely not the only one she's been talking about. But I've been trying to build something different. Creating a real sense of community where we can trust each other. It's hard when someone's always trying to tear people apart. Mark didn't respond immediately, but I could see him thinking. He had always been a good guy, and now he was starting to see the reality behind Karen's facade. By the end of our conversation, I could tell that he was starting to distance himself from her in his mind. And that was exactly what I wanted. The next week, I had a chance encounter with another neighbor, Julie, who had always been a little too eager to please Karen. She had always been friendly but seemed to orbit around Karen like a moon, never straying too far from her influence. But that was beginning to change too. During a neighborhood barbecue, I casually started talking about the community's dynamics. I've been thinking a lot about what makes a neighborhood work, I began, offering her a friendly smile. It's not just about the yard work or who throws the best parties. It's about the connections we build with one another. Some people, though, don't see it that way. They're too focused on stirring up trouble. Julie's eyes darted around nervously, and I knew Karen's influence was still fresh in her mind. But I pressed on, lightly. Karen's always got something to say about everyone, doesn't she? It's like she's never happy unless people are a little uncomfortable. I'm just not sure what's behind that, Julie hesitated, looking over at Karen who was across the yard, chatting animatedly with another neighbor. She does have a way of talking, doesn't she? Julie said, almost in a whisper. Oh, it's more than just talking, I replied smoothly. She likes to put people in boxes. Likes to have things just so, but at what cost? Sometimes, I wonder if she's more interested in controlling the narrative than actually being a part of the community. The words hung in the air for a moment, and I could see the discomfort in Julie's face. She wasn't sure how to respond, but I could tell I had struck a chord. I wasn't accusing Karen of anything directly, I was simply allowing Julie to come to her own conclusions, to realize that Karen's influence wasn't all it appeared to be. The shift in Julie's demeanor was subtle but telling. Her nervousness faded a little as she looked away from Karen, her eyes scanning the group. She was starting to see Karen in a different light. By the end of the evening, I had planted just enough doubt to make Julie question the person she had so blindly followed. It wasn't about pushing people away from Karen. It was about allowing them to slowly realize her true nature on their own. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a change. People were starting to distance themselves. They didn't need me to tell them Karen was a manipulator. They were beginning to see it for themselves. But I wasn't done. This was just the beginning of the end for her. And I had every intention of making sure that when the walls finally came down, she would have no one left to turn to. As the weeks turned into months, I watched with a growing sense of satisfaction as Karen's once ironclad grip on the neighborhood began to loosen. I had made sure to stay in the background, acting like a neutral observer, never pushing too hard, never revealing my cards. I had sown the seeds of doubt, and now it was time for those seeds to grow into something undeniable. The best part was, Karen still had no idea what was happening. She continued her usual routine, gossiping, whispering, and manipulating as she always had, completely oblivious to the fact that the very foundation of her social empire was crumbling beneath her feet. One of the most satisfying parts of the process was watching the subtle shifts in the dynamics between Karen and her closest allies. I knew that once one person started to question her motives, it would only take a small push for others to follow suit. And that's exactly what happened with Linda. She had always been one of Karen's most loyal supporters, but after I had planted a few seeds during our conversation, I noticed something different the next time I saw them together at a neighborhood meeting. Karen was in the middle of one of her usual monologues, talking about how chaotic one of the other neighbors' homes had become. She spoke in that familiar tone, the one that made people feel like they were getting an inside scoop, the kind of gossip that made people lean in, eager to hear more. But when I glanced over at Linda, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. She wasn't hanging on every word Karen said. In fact, she looked bored, even a little disgusted. After the meeting, I casually pulled Linda aside. "Hey, I saw you and Karen chatting earlier. Everything okay?" I asked, my tone light but with just the right amount of curiosity. Linda hesitated for a moment before responding, "Yeah, I guess. I don't know. I've just been thinking about things lately, you know. Some of the stuff Karen says, it doesn't feel right. She acts like she's got all the answers, but sometimes I wonder if she's just stirring the pot." That was it, the crack in Karen's armor was widening. I smiled inwardly, but kept my expression neutral. "Yeah, I've noticed that too. It's like she can't resist getting involved in other people's business, always with that helpful tone. But sometimes, I wonder if it's really about helping or if it's just about control." Linda nodded slowly, her eyes darting around to make sure no one else was listening. "I think you're right. It's like, she's trying to make us all feel like we're messed up so that she looks better. I don't know. I just don't know if I can trust her anymore." The words hung in the air between us, and I knew that I had successfully broken her loyalty to Karen. It wasn't a loud confrontation, but the damage was done. Linda's trust in Karen had been shaken, and that was exactly what I had been working toward. But I didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, I made sure to keep the pressure on, all while making sure I stayed in the shadows. Every time I spoke with someone, I dropped a casual comment about Karen's behavior, just enough to make them reconsider their assumptions. And it was working. Slowly but surely, the cracks in Karen's influence were becoming more and more apparent. At the next neighborhood event, I could feel the shift. People weren't as quick to rally around Karen. They didn't jump to her defense when she made her usual pointed remarks. In fact, a few even seemed to avoid her altogether, opting to engage with others instead. And when Karen noticed, her response was telling. She started to get defensive, her tone becoming sharper, her words more pointed. She was beginning to feel the pressure. One night, as I was walking back from the community center, I happened to cross paths with Julie again. This time, her demeanor was different. She wasn't following Karen around like she used to, and there was a certain clarity in her eyes. As we exchanged pleasantries, Julie didn't immediately bring up Karen, which was unusual for her. But I could see the change in her. She was starting to see the truth. "David," she said, hesitating for a moment as though she was weighing her words carefully. "I've been thinking about something. You know, you're right. About Karen. There's always something behind the scenes with her, isn't there?" I nodded, not wanting to rush her. "I didn't really notice it at first," she continued, "but now that I think about it, she's always got a way of making everyone else look bad, and she's never wrong. She's always got some kind of judgment on everyone's life, but now I'm wondering, maybe she's not the perfect neighbor she makes herself out to be." This was a victory. I hadn't pushed her. I hadn't tried to force her hand. Julie had come to the conclusion on her own, and that's when the real power began to shift. She wasn't just a passive follower of Karen anymore. She was starting to see through the smoke and mirrors. The beauty of this process was that it wasn't about a single moment of triumph. It wasn't a loud confrontation or a dramatic showdown. No, it was much quieter than that. It was about patience, about letting Karen's own actions speak louder than anything I could say. I was simply the catalyst, the spark that had ignited the flame. And now, all I had to do was let the fire burn. The turning point came one evening when the entire neighborhood gathered at the local park for the annual summer barbecue. It was a chance for everyone to mingle, catch up, and celebrate the sense of community that, at least on the surface, seemed to hold us all together. I had no intention of making a scene, but I knew it was the perfect opportunity for Karen to reveal her true nature. And I couldn't wait for the moment when it would happen. The evening started like any other. People were laughing, the grill was sizzling, and kids ran around playing tag. But as the night wore on, I could sense the tension building. Karen was doing her usual routine, making sure everyone knew what she thought about this or that, but there was something different about the way people were reacting. They weren't hanging on her every word. They weren't nodding in agreement the way they had in the past. And then, it happened. Karen, sensing that her grip was slipping, tried to steer the conversation in her usual direction, casting judgment on a neighbor who had just separated from her husband. But this time, something unexpected occurred. "I just don't understand why people can't get their lives together," Karen said, her voice loud enough for the group to hear. "I mean, honestly, it's not that hard. If you want a happy family, you have to put the work in, and some people just don't do that. They'd rather sit around and blame everyone else for their problems." There was a moment of stunned silence before Linda, who had been standing nearby, spoke up. "Karen, maybe it's not about blaming others. Maybe it's about understanding that life isn't perfect, and people make mistakes. No one has it all figured out." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a split second, I could see the shock on Karen's face. She hadn't expected to be challenged, not in front of the entire group. Julie, standing next to Linda, nodded in agreement. "I think Karen's point is a little off. People go through things. We're all just trying to get by." The tables had turned. Karen's manipulative game was no longer working. She was the one on the defensive now, and she knew it. For the first time, I saw real cracks in her facade. She couldn't maintain her perfect image anymore. The web she had so carefully spun was starting to unravel, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as the once unshakable foundation of Karen's social circle crumbled. It was almost poetic, the way she had built her influence on lies, only to have it all fall apart with a few simple truths. But this was just the beginning. Karen might have been exposed, but the best part of the revenge was yet to come. Now that the neighborhood saw her for who she truly was, I could let the final act unfold. And I was ready for it. By the time the summer barbecue had ended, Karen was visibly rattled. She had tried to salvage the conversation, to regain control, but the damage had been done. Linda and Julie had sided against her, and the others had remained silent, choosing not to engage. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could tell that the once gilded image Karen had crafted of herself was beginning to tarnish. For days after the barbecue, I watched from a distance as the neighborhood's dynamics shifted. Karen, who once thrived on her position of influence, was now forced to hover on the outskirts of every conversation, no longer the center of attention. The gossip she had so carefully cultivated was falling on deaf ears. People weren't avoiding her outright, but they were certainly questioning her more, and that was exactly what I needed. But as much as I enjoyed watching her crumble, I knew the final blow still had to come. Karen needed to understand that her behavior wasn't just annoying or a nuisance, it had consequences. She needed to see that her manipulative tactics had cost her everything, and only then would she truly regret her actions. I spent the following weeks building up more trust with the neighbors. I continued to act as the good guy, the one who was always there to lend a hand, to offer advice, or to simply listen. I cultivated relationships carefully, giving just enough of myself to make others feel like they could confide in me without feeling judged. It wasn't about playing the saint, it was about ensuring that when the final reveal came, no one would question where the truth had come from. I had all the pieces in place now. All that was left was to ensure that Karen's lies would be exposed in a way that would be undeniable. I was careful with my words, never directly attacking her, but always dropping hints, allowing people to connect the dots. And soon, the first major shift came. Mark, the quiet neighbor I had spoken to months earlier, approached me one afternoon, his face filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "David, I need to talk to you," he said, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I think I've figured something out. It's about Karen." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression calm. "What's going on?" Mark took a deep breath, clearly uncomfortable. "You know how she's been talking about Sarah and her financial issues? The whole town's been gossiping about it. Well, I found out that Karen's been spreading rumors about Sarah's finances without any proof. She's been making it sound like Sarah's been hiding something big. But here's the thing, Sarah's got nothing to hide. I asked around, and it turns out, Karen's been telling people a lot of things that aren't true." I had to suppress a grin. This was exactly what I needed. Mark had gone directly to the source of Karen's influence and found out for himself just how far her lies had stretched. "That's interesting," I said, nodding thoughtfully. "What do you think we should do about it?" Mark hesitated, clearly torn. "I don't know. I'm just fed up. I've been thinking about talking to Sarah, but I don't know if she'll believe me. I don't want to get caught up in all this drama." I put a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile. "I get it. But you don't have to handle this alone. Maybe it's time we show everyone what's really been going on. You're not the only one who's been affected by Karen's gossip." Mark looked at me for a moment, and I could see the shift in his demeanor. He was no longer the passive bystander he had been before. He was starting to see Karen for who she truly was, a manipulator who had been playing everyone for years. "You're right," he said. "Maybe it's time to take her down." We agreed to meet with a few of the other neighbors who had been on the receiving end of Karen's gossip. I knew that the more people we had on our side, the harder it would be for Karen to weasel her way out of this. The truth was on our side, and it was time to bring it to light. The meeting happened a few days later, at the same community center where Karen had tried to hold court just weeks before. This time, there was no barbecue, no festive atmosphere, just a small group of neighbors, gathered to discuss the truth about Karen. Mark, Linda, Julie, and a few others who had been manipulated by Karen's lies were there, each of them eager to finally confront her. "We can't keep letting her control the narrative," Linda said, her voice firm. "I've been watching her for months now, and I see the way she twists everything. It's like she thinks we're all just pawns in her game." Julie nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. "I think we've all had enough. It's time we took a stand and showed Karen she can't do this anymore." I smiled to myself. This was exactly what I had been waiting for, the moment when the power shifted from Karen to the very people she had tried to manipulate. The group was united, and together, we were going to take down the Queen of Gossip. But we weren't going to do it in a public confrontation. No, that would be too easy. We were going to expose her for who she really was, piece by piece, and let her self-destruction unfold in front of everyone. Over the next few days, I started putting the plan into action. I casually mentioned Karen's name to a few more people, dropping hints about how her recent gossip had been unfounded, how she had been spreading lies about one of the other families. It was all about planting the seed. Slowly, people started to talk. And as they did, more and more of Karen's lies came to light. The tipping point came during the next neighborhood meeting, where Karen attempted to rally her supporters once again. But this time, she wasn't met with the eager nods of approval she was used to. Instead, there was a noticeable coldness in the air. People were no longer buying into her narrative. And when I casually mentioned that Sarah had confirmed the rumors Karen had been spreading about her finances were completely false, the room went silent. "I'm sorry, Karen," I said, my voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "But the truth is, Sarah has nothing to hide. You've been spreading lies for far too long, and it's time everyone knew the truth about how you've been manipulating this entire neighborhood." Karen's face turned pale, the color draining from her cheeks as she looked around the room. The whispers started, soft at first, then growing louder as more people realized the truth. She tried to protest, to defend herself, but it was too late. The web of lies she had spun over the years had finally caught up to her. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It didn't need to be. The truth had already done its work. Karen's influence was shattered, her reputation in tatters. The neighbors who had once feared her now saw her for what she truly was, a woman who thrived on manipulation and deception. As the meeting ended and the group slowly dispersed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karen had spent years trying to control the neighborhood, to make everyone doubt themselves, to divide us all. But in the end, it was her own lies that destroyed her. The revenge had been long in the making, but it was worth every second. And as for Karen? Well, I'm sure she'll never forget the lesson she learned that day. The consequences of her actions had caught up with her, and there was nothing she could do to escape them. The weeks following Karen's public downfall felt almost surreal. I had spent so much time carefully orchestrating her demise, biding my time, waiting for the right moment, that when it finally happened, I wasn't sure what to feel. There was no elation, no sense of victory in the traditional sense, just a quiet satisfaction. It was over. The neighborhood had seen Karen for what she was, a manipulator, a gossip, someone who tore others down to build herself up. And now, her influence had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. It wasn't immediate. People didn't throw her out of the neighborhood, or confront her in a dramatic fashion. It wasn't that kind of defeat. The social fabric was more fragile than that. What had been shattered was trust, and trust, once broken, was difficult to repair. I noticed it first in the way people interacted with her. They weren't rude. No, they were polite, but distant. Conversations would start, but they would always seem to falter, to lose steam. Karen no longer commanded the room with her presence. She was just another face in the crowd, and that was more humiliating than any public confrontation could have been. I saw it most clearly when I ran into her at the grocery store a few weeks after the meeting. She was picking through the produce section, her cart half filled with things I knew she'd never actually cook. Her hair, once styled perfectly, now looked a little disheveled. She glanced at me as I passed, and for the briefest of moments, I saw a flicker of recognition, a look that said she knew exactly what had happened, and that she understood she had lost. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She gave a tight smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. "David," she said, her voice as smooth as ever, but lacking its usual warmth. "I didn't realize you shopped here." I didn't miss the subtle undertone in her words, the suggestion that I was now beneath her, not worthy of the same space. It was a poor attempt at reclaiming some of the power she had lost, but it was too late for that. "I've been meaning to ask you," she continued, clearly trying to maintain control of the conversation. "You've been talking to everyone lately, haven't you? It seems like you've been influencing people." I leaned against the shelf, my smile steady and easy. "Influencing?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "I wouldn't put it that way. I'm just someone who listens. Seems like some people have a lot on their minds these days." The tension in her posture was immediate. Her eyes flickered, the briefest sign of uncertainty creeping into her usually sharp demeanor. "I see," she said, but it was clear she didn't. She didn't understand how her reign of quiet manipulation had ended. The shift in the neighborhood was too subtle for her to recognize, but I knew she felt it. She had lost control, and now she was floundering, desperately grasping for a sense of power she would never regain. As I turned to leave, I could feel her eyes on my back, the weight of her gaze following me down the aisle. But I didn't look back. I didn't need to. In the days that followed, I noticed the changes in Karen's behavior. She became more isolated, withdrawing from the social circles she had once dominated. She'd show up to neighborhood events, but no one seemed eager to approach her. It wasn't long before she stopped coming altogether. The gossip that had once flowed freely from her lips was now replaced with a quiet bitterness that no one wanted to engage with. I saw it as a small but significant victory, one that didn't need to be flaunted. But Karen wasn't the only one affected by the unraveling of her web of lies. The entire neighborhood felt the ripples of her manipulation. People who had once been pitted against each other, divided by her whispers and subtle insinuations, began to talk openly again. Old friendships were mended, and new ones began to form. I watched as the social fabric of the neighborhood slowly healed, as trust was rebuilt piece by piece. One afternoon, as I sat in the park with Linda, we had a quiet conversation that I knew would come eventually. She had been one of the most vocal in standing up to Karen, and as a result, she had become a kind of unofficial leader in the community. People were turning to her now, looking for guidance, and I could see that she was starting to step into a role of greater responsibility. "You know," Linda said, her voice thoughtful, "it's funny. All these years, I thought Karen was this perfect example of the kind of person we should all aspire to be. But it turns out, she was just a bully in disguise." I nodded. She made it seem like she had all the answers, but the truth is, she was the one who needed help. She just didn't know how to ask for it. Linda looked at me, a small smile on her lips. "You've changed things around here, David. I think we all owe you a lot for that. You showed us what she was really doing, without ever making a big deal about it." I shrugged, trying to play it down. "I didn't do much. I just listened, and sometimes, that's enough. People needed to see what was happening, and I think they're starting to realize it." Karen's lies were the real problem. "You know," she continued, "it's not just Karen. I've been thinking a lot about how we let someone like her get away with so much for so long. It's almost like we were all too scared to question her." "That's the power of manipulation," I replied. "It's not about being loud or aggressive. It's about making people feel small so they doubt themselves. When you stop doubting, you can start seeing the truth." And that, I realized, was the key. Karen had relied on the fear of doubt to control everyone. But once I had shown people how to stop doubting themselves, they had found their voices again. It was never about me or Karen. It was about giving the neighborhood the power to see through the lies, to reclaim what had been taken from them. But even as I sat there with Linda, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew the hardest part of the revenge was still to come. It wasn't the moment when Karen had been exposed. It wasn't the conversations that had been had or the whispers that had spread through the neighborhood. The hardest part would be watching Karen face the consequences of her actions, the isolation, the loneliness, the realization that she had no one left to manipulate. That would be her true punishment. And as much as I'd prepared myself for it, there was still a small part of me that couldn't help but feel a faint flicker of pity for her. But pity wouldn't change anything. Not now. Karen had made her choices, and now she would face them alone. And as the community grew stronger, as people built the bonds Karen had tried to break, I knew that in the end, she had only succeeded in driving us closer together. I'd won. Weeks turned into months, and the full weight of Karen's social isolation began to settle over her like a dark cloud. At first, I noticed it in the small things, the empty parking spots where her car used to be, the lonely stretches of sidewalk where she used to walk with her head held high. She had become a shadow of the woman she had once been. At first, she fought it. She attended the occasional neighborhood event, trying to reclaim her old place as the queen of the cul-de-sac. But it was no use. People no longer turned to her for advice or gossip. The subtle accusations that had once been so expertly woven into her conversations were now met with silence. I saw it in her eyes the first time we crossed paths at the community pool. She was sitting by the water, looking like she was trying to blend in, but there was something desperate about her demeanor. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by an anxious energy that I hadn't seen before. She no longer carried herself like the neighborhood's untouchable figure. She looked like someone who was starting to realize that her power had crumbled, and she didn't know how to get it back. I pretended not to notice, as I always did. I passed by her without a second glance, as if she were just another neighbor, and that's when I saw it, her head snap in my direction, the sharp recognition flashing across her face. Her mouth opened as if she was about to say something, but she stopped herself. The pride that once defined her was still there, but it was now tinged with fear, a fear that she could no longer manipulate the way she once had. She didn't speak to me that day, and it became clear that she wouldn't. There was a tension in the air between us, one that hadn't existed before. She no longer had the upper hand. Karen was slowly being pushed to the fringes of the neighborhood, and there was nothing she could do about it. But the hardest part for her wasn't the isolation. It wasn't the cold shoulders or the whispers behind her back. The hardest part for Karen was knowing that she had no one to blame but herself. She had spent so much of her life controlling the narrative, controlling the lives of others, but now she had nothing left. The web of lies she had woven had finally unraveled, and she was left standing in the center of the ruins. I could see it in her face every time we came into contact, that quiet desperation. She wanted to lash out, to blame me for everything, but she couldn't. It was too late for that. There were no more rumors to spread, no more people to manipulate. The last card she had to play was one she couldn't even use. One evening, I walked by her house, taking my usual route home. It was late, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. As I passed her driveway, I noticed Karen standing in front of her house, staring at something in her hands. She looked lost in thought, the weight of the past few months finally catching up to her. I had no idea what she was holding, but the way her fingers gripped it told me everything I needed to know. For a moment, I considered walking by without acknowledging her, but something made me stop. I turned toward her, and for the first time in months, Karen looked me directly in the eye. There was no animosity, no pride, just a quiet resignation. She seemed smaller, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. "David," she said, her voice quiet, almost fragile. "You got what you wanted, didn't you?" I took a breath, feeling the familiar sense of calm that had accompanied me throughout this entire ordeal. "I didn't want anything from you, Karen," I replied softly. "I just wanted the truth to come out. You were the one who created the lies." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes darted to the ground, and for a moment, I thought she might say something else. But she didn't. Instead, she slowly turned and walked inside, leaving me standing there in the quiet of the night. That was the moment I knew Karen had been defeated, not by me, but by her own actions. She had spent years manipulating others, but in the end, it was her lies that had destroyed her. The truth was her greatest enemy, and it was only when it came to light that she realized she had no one left to blame but herself. The weeks that followed were a quiet affair. Karen faded further into the background, no longer a figure of importance in the neighborhood. People still saw her, still exchanged pleasantries with her, but the warmth that had once surrounded her was gone. The cracks in her facade were too wide to cover up. She became a non-entity, a ghost of the woman who had once controlled everything. And as for me? Well, the satisfaction of watching her unravel was fleeting. It wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about restoring balance, about making sure that those who had been manipulated were able to take back what was rightfully theirs. In a way, I had helped the neighborhood heal, not by tearing Karen down, but by showing them how to see through the lies. One afternoon, a few months later, I found myself sitting with Linda at the local coffee shop, watching the world go by. The sun was shining, the air crisp, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt peaceful again. "You know, David," Linda said, her voice thoughtful, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think we're finally free of her. The whole neighborhood feels different now. It's like we can all finally breathe again." I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. "Yeah. It's amazing what happens when people can just be themselves without constantly looking over their shoulders." "I don't know how you did it," she continued, "but I think you did more than just expose Karen. You showed us how to take our lives back." It wasn't the kind of praise I expected, but it felt right. The revenge, in the end, hadn't been about making Karen suffer, it had been about restoring the peace that she had so carelessly destroyed. And now, the neighborhood was better for it. Karen may have been defeated, but the true victory was in the community we had rebuilt together. We had all learned a valuable lesson: manipulation may win battles, but truth wins wars. And Karen? She had lost the only war that truly mattered.